5 Markup as a Merchandising Tool Part 4. And I will cover the cumulative markup and maintain markup for this Chapter 5 Part 4. So let's go ahead and start to talk about cumulative markup. Cumulative markup is also an average markup. However, it is discussed in this separate section because this is a special type of markup. And I briefly mentioned about this cumulative markup when we talked about the timing of the markup. Initial markup, cumulative markup, and maintain markup. So your initial markup is gonna be your plan at the beginning, and your cumulative markup you can check for the specific period of time, and maintain markup, that's gonna be your actual maintained markup at the end. So your cumulative markup is the average markup resulting from the markup on the beginning inventory and the purchases received during a specified period. And your cumulative markup is calculated on a season to date basis. Then how can you calculate this cumulative markup? Let's look at the next slide about the formula to calculate this dollar cumulative markup and also the percentage of it. First, your dollar cumulative markup can be calculated as your total retail price of merchandising minus total delivered cost of merchandise for a period of time. So that is that markup is retail minus cost. But for this cumulative markup, that will be for the specific period of time. And you need to calculate the total amount to get this cumulative markup dollar. And cumulative retail. You can calculate this cumulative retail as beginning inventory plus receipt. So beginning inventory means that the merchandise, so the stock that you have on hand. So you already have this inventory, the product. Plus receipt means that merchandise on order. So you order it and it's on its way. And your cumulative markup percent can be calculated based on these two. So your cumulative markup dollar divided by cumulative retail will be your cumulative markup percent. Then let's look at this table. Calculate cumulative markup based on this. So based on this table, some of the figures are given. For your first column, that's about your opening inventory, and second column is about your purchases. So if you know these two, you can calculate your total handled merchandise. In this case, your retail opening inventory given, and also you know markup percentage for the opening inventory, and also you know the purchases at cost, and you know the markup percentage at purchases. Then what you can do, you can calculate all these A, B, C, D, E. First, you need to calculate purchases at retail, and that will be, since you know your purchases at cost, it will be your purchases dollar amount at cost divided by cost percentage. We did this in the previous lecture. Dollar amount of the cost divided by cost percentage, that will be your retail. And B, opening inventory at cost. That will be opening inventory at retail multiplied with 100 minus opening inventory markup percent. So you can get this one too. And C, your total handle merchandise at retail is gonna be your opening inventory at retail plus purchases at retail. So combination between two is gonna be C. And for D, total handled at cost is gonna be your opening inventory at cost plus purchases at cost. So D can be calculated as B plus these purchases at cost. If you know that, then you can calculate this markup percentage based on the answer from C and D. Total handled markup percent will be total handled at retail minus total handled at cost, because that's gonna be the markup, divided by total handled at retail. So you can do it by step. Then let's look at this example. The shoe department show an opening inventory of $80,000 at retail with a markup of 48%. during the month, purchases were received in the amount of $30,000 at cost that were marked up 52%. Find the cumulative markup percent for the department. So now you know your opening inventory at retail and you know the markup percentage for the opening inventory and for the purchases, and you also know the purchases at cost. So let's go ahead and start from A. Your opening inventory at cost. Since you know your opening inventory at retail and you know your markup percentage, you can multiply with your total opening inventory retail and your 100 minus markup percentage. So that will be 80,000 multiplied with the 100% because retail is 100%, right? Minus markup percentage, that's gonna be cost percentage, which is 52%. So if you multiply that with the opening inventory at retail, then you got this 41,600 as your cost for the opening inventory. Then let's go ahead and calculate B. So what's the question is your purchases at retail. And you can calculate this since you know your cost for the purchases and you know the markup percentage, because your retail dollar amount can be calculated as your dollar cost divided by cost percentage, and your cost percentage will be 100 minus markup percentage. So in this case that will be 30,000, which is the cost from the below here, 30,000 divided by 100 minus 52%. So that will be 62,500. So you can say your purchases at retail was $62,500. Since you got this number, now you can calculate your total merchandise handled at retail and also at cost. So let's go ahead and do C. Total merchandise handled at retail. That will be opening inventory at retail plus your purchases at retail. So 80,000 plus 62,500, then you got this 142,500 as your total merchandise handle. So you combine these two, opening inventory and purchases. And also for D, same, but you will get the number from the below here column. So that will be row here. So that will be 41,600 plus 30,000. Then you got this 71,600 as your cost for the total merchandise handle. So since you know your retail and cost for the total merchandise handle, you can calculate your markup percentage, your cumulative markup percentage. That will be the difference between these two is gonna be your dollar markup, right? So you calculate that and you will divide it by your retail. So there will be 142,500 minus 71,600 was 70,900, and then divide that by your retail, which is 142,500, then you get this 49.75%. So you can say your cumulative markup for this time, for this month, was 49.75%. Okay, so you know how to calculate your cumulative markup now, also in dollar and also in percentage. Now let's look at the maintained markup, the next concept. So also it's related to the timing of the markup, and this is gonna be your maintained markup. Your maintained markup is the final markup obtained by a retail store when merchandise is sold. So that's gonna be your actual maintained markup. And your maintained markup is based on actual sale of goods rather than unplanned sales. So it's not about the plan, it's gonna be your actual one. And retail reduction, including markdowns, stock shortages, and discount to reduce the retail value that can actually be achieved through this. So you can kind of check it based on your actual number, your maintained markup with the actual figures. And your maintain markup does not reflect the deductions for cash discounts and workroom or alteration cost. You included this for your initial markup, but for your maintain markup, you're not gonna reflect this. It's more about your merchandise sold, like products. So you are not gonna include this for your maintain markup, but you're gonna use that later for the next step when you calculate your gross margin markup. But for your maintain markup, they don't consider this workroom or alteration cost for this maintain markup. And the buyer cannot determine maintain markup in advance, of course, because it's not your plan. It's like an actual figure, actual number that you can get from your actual sales and actual markup. Then how can you calculate your maintain markup? That will be net sales or actual retail obtained minus gross cost of merchandise. The gross cost of merchandise means that it doesn't include your alteration cost. Okay. And also it's not gonna include any like a cash discount. So before you consider this cash discount or alteration cost, that's gonna be gross, right? Before you calculate the net. And your maintain markup can be calculated as maintained markup dollar amount divided by maintained retail. So these will be calculated from the real number that you got from your sales. And that will be your net sales minus gross cost of merchandise sold, which came from above, divided by your actual net sales. Then look at this. Relationship between maintained markup and gross margin. Each represent markup achieved after the merchandise is sold. So that's gonna be actual one. But your maintained markup differ from your gross margin in that gross margin take into consideration cash discounts and alteration or workroom cost. Because your maintained markup will be calculated before they consider this cash discount or any other alteration or workroom cost. But for your gross margin percent, you will take these two concepts, cash discount and alteration and workroom cost, into consideration. So your gross margin will be your net sale minus total cost of merchandise sold. So the difference between the maintained markup and gross margin, you see this is the total cost of merchandise sold, not the gross cost of merchandise sold. So this take into consideration for this both alteration cost and your cash discount. And your gross margin percent will be net sales minus total cost of merchandise sold divided by net sale. So you get the different percentage. Your gross margin percentage and your maintained markup, there will be a little bit of difference. But imagine that if you don't have any alteration cost involved, or if you don't have any cash discount, then your gross margin percentage and your maintained markup will be same. Then let's look at this example. This shows you lots of information, but for this example, I'll show you the big picture of that. So it gave you the information about the net sales, and also it gives you the information about the cost of merchandise sold. And also it gave you the information about gross cost of merchandise and total cost of merchandise. And you also have this gross margin information there. For this, you can calculate both maintained markup and also your gross margin percentage. In this case, for this middle part, I just want to show you your net sales. You're going to use that for calculation for as your denominator. But your cost of merchandise sold, you're going to learn more about these details about how to calculate all these total merchandise handle and so on in the chapter 7 when you talk about inventory. So don't worry about too much about the details about that, but I want you to look at this gross cost of merchandise to calculate your maintained markup and total cost of merchandise to calculate your gross margin percentage. So for this case, let me just briefly talk about this. To calculate your gross cost of merchandise, you can calculate it based on your merchandise available. So that's going to be total merchandise handle. And your merchandise available. When you think about each concept, you can kind of think about it because opening inventory, that's what you have. So it's available. Also, gross purchases, you got more, so you can add that. But if you return something to the vendor, that will be minus to your inventory. So you minus that. Then you get these net purchases based on these two. And you also include your freight inward if you have any freight, because that's going to be involved in the cost. Then you can calculate your total merchandise handle. So that means that total merchandise available. And if you deduct the closing inventory, think about that. So total merchandise available minus closing inventory, your final inventory left. That's gonna be your cost of merchandise sold. So your merchandise available or handled minus closing inventory is gonna be your gross cost of merchandise sold. So you got this 145,000 as your gross cost of merchandise. And this one didn't consider cash discounts or alterations. In this case, there are some cash discount and alteration. So to get your total cost of merchandise, so it's more like a net cost of merchandise sold, you're gonna deduct your cash discount and then plus your alteration. Then you got this total cost of merchandise as your net cost of merchandise sold. And you will use this to calculate your gross margin percentage, right? Then let's go ahead and look at how you can calculate your maintained markup first. Your maintained markup percentage be your net sales minus which cost of merchandise sold, gross or total. It is gross, right? Gross cost of merchandise sold. So that's before take this cash discount or alteration into consideration. So you do net sale minus gross merchandise cost of merchandise, which is 145,000, divided by your net sale, which is 250,000. Then you got this 42% as your maintained markup. And now you can calculate your gross margin percentage too. Your gross margin percentage will be your net sales minus your total cost of merchandise sold, not the gross one. So it's gonna be total after you take this into consideration for the cash discount and alteration. And then you can divide it by your net sale. So then you can get this 44.2% as your gross margin percentage. So now you know how to calculate both maintained markup and gross margin percentage. And you see that once again, if you don't have the cash discount or net or other alteration cost, then your maintained markup and your gross margin percentage will be same. But if you have this additional like cash discount or alterations, then your maintained markup and gross margin percentage will be different. Okay, so this last section of chapter 5, you learn about two important concepts based on the timing of the markup. You learn the cumulative markup and maintained markup. So now you know how to calculate all this. And also one of the important concept is gonna be think about the total amount first, and then you can calculate your percentage based on this total value for the retail and cost. Then you get this markup dollar amount for the total, and then you can get your percentage. Okay, so that's it for this chapter, and let's go ahead and briefly look at the summary for this chapter. So we started to talk about the markup definition, and then you learn the markup as percent, because to compare, that's important to learn as a percent, and you learn basic and the markup calculation, and also markup percent on a group of items. because that's what you're gonna do. If you're working for the company, it's not just dealing with just one item. And you also learn the timing of markups, initial markup, cumulative markup, and your maintained markup. And you also learn averaging markup. And then we talked about these three different markup: initial, cumulative, and maintained markup based on the timing of the markup. Okay, so that's all for chapter 5. So there are lots of information and lots of calculation that you need to do. But if you look at this concept, if you know this basic big concept about retail equal to cost plus markup, and your markup is gonna be retail minus cost, then you can get pretty much most of this concept easily. But at the same time, I also want you to distinguish the different markup types. Which one is for when, and what does that mean? So that's it for chapter 5, and I'll see you the next time to talk about your more retail pricing for profits.